Jason Grimay, president of the Bipartisan Policy Center. It is really a pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion about competition and innovation, and really terrific to start this off with one of the key leaders of this initiative, which is Senator Todd Young from Indiana. Senator Young is a principled conservative who knows how to build coalitions to get things done for the American people. He is leading efforts around telehealth and seniors, small business efforts, agriculture, national security, and of course, has been really one of the forces behind today's discussion. Introduced the lyrical Endless Frontiers bill back in 2020 with Senator Schumer, and really also sits in the kind of the crucible. You are, if I got this correctly, on the Committee on Foreign Relations, Finance, Committee on Science and Transportation, and Small Business and Entrepreneurship. So if we get to a legislative conference, you can kind of do this by yourself, which I think is encouraging for the outcome. So look, I want to jump into this. I want to talk a little bit just about kind of the broad goals, touch on a couple of the key provisions, and then may ask you some questions about the future. But look, just to kick this off, you know, the word competitiveness, it's a nice word, but it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Just kind of level set for us a little bit. When you think about competitiveness, you know, what does that inspire for you?
Well, competitiveness is part of the very fabric and tradition of the American people. It's been something that is woven throughout our history, and we are competitors. We have a system of government. We have a continent-wide dynamic economy, and we have a people that is competitive against the rest of the world. And if we fall behind in any particular areas, the American people like their leaders to attend to that and do whatever we can to harness their potential, to harness their creativity and power and work ethic, so that we can outcompete the rest of the world, especially those who challenge our value system. Right now, there's rightly an increasing interest in the extent to which we are falling behind in certain areas of technology development, and will fall behind in other areas if our leaders don't begin investing more in innovation, basic research in some areas, applied research in other areas, and harnessing the talent of many of our entrepreneurs, innovators, investors, and researchers around the United States, so that we can lead the way in developing technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and robotics and so forth, which will not only drive our economic growth moving forward, but also allow us to defend the United States against those who don't share our values. So innovation has always been important to our growth and to our military potential, but it's especially important in this era as our military has become increasingly dependent on these next generation technologies. And there's no reason why we can't optimize our own system to lead the way in developing these technologies. So we can not only be competitive, frankly, we can ensure that this century is the second American century. We often refer to the 20th century as the American century. I believe that if we have the right leadership and we harness the power and potential of our people, we can defend our values, our way of life. But it's going to take some adaptation. This won't happen by itself.
So, Senator, I want to kind of follow up a little bit on the now, right? We've all heard, you know, fierce urgency of now. The country is still gripped by the pandemic and economic recovery, some very serious foreign policy crises that are, I think, appropriately focusing the government's attention. Getting things done at all isn't easy, but there seems like there's a real shot at a major piece of bipartisan legislation. And so say a little more about the now. You know, what has allowed the Congress to really coalesce around this conversation?
Well, as fundamental as innovation is to defending our values and our way of life moving forward, and allowing each individual American to achieve their dreams of more material wealth and realizing their full potential, we really don't have a cohesive economic strategy to take us into the 21st century. This has been a source of real frustration for me and some of my colleagues in recent years, irrespective of party affiliation. Let me get detailed. What is our nation's strategy as it relates to trade? When do we apply tariffs? Under what circumstances? Should they be bilateral or multilateral? That should be part of an overall strategy, as should our strategy as it relates to export controls and technology development and all these areas of economic policy. They, of course, have very important national security implications, but they also have implications for domestic growth, and I would even say our cohesion as a country. I mean, if we're not bringing everyone along in this dynamic, hyper-competitive 21st century economy, some people are going to become alienated. There's a happy coincidence between domestic policy here and foreign policy. If we're able to harness the power and potential of rank and file Americans, we'll grow at a faster rate, we'll out-innovate and out-compete others like the Chinese Communist Party. And once again, this can become our century.
So, Senator, you mentioned something I think is really important, and that is the idea that competition is in the entire country's DNA. And we've seen innovation kind of land in some very particular zip codes. My sense is there's a lot of shared interest in making sure that the entire nation would reap the benefits of this kind of investment. Just maybe reflecting a little bit on your experiences with innovation in Indiana, what does the legislation do or need to do to make sure that it's equitable in its efforts?
Sure, I'd love, of course, to speak to that, because in Indiana, we're really proud of what we've done to improve sort of the table stakes of creating a strong economic policy environment. We have a great business and tax and regulatory environment. We have some world-class companies. You think of Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical manufacturer. You think of Rolls-Royce, which develops amazing tools for aerospace and for the auto sector. So we have countless great companies in Indiana and a strong policy environment and some world-class universities like Indiana University and the University of Notre Dame. Yet, if you look at states like Indiana, there are several that aspire to achieve our level of strength when it comes to a positive business and working environment, and yet we're not attracting all that much venture capital. 80% of venture capital goes to just 3 states. It's California, New York, and Massachusetts. So there's incredible untapped opportunity. Once again, this is about harnessing the potential of people all across the country. So what this legislation does is, first, we want to reshore some essential manufacturing capabilities, semiconductors in particular. That would be the CHIPS Act. Second, we want to invest in areas of applied research where we've seen funding go down over the years, areas like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and autonomous systems. We can and should lead the way in these areas, and this will increase the productivity of your manufacturing worker in the places like Indiana, so that those workers and their families can enjoy a higher standard of living. But perhaps most exciting to me and to Hoosiers is the establishment of regional tech hubs. My state of Indiana, perhaps in partnership with some surrounding states, has the ability to take existing expertise, say in battery storage or advanced manufacturing, apply to be designated a federal tech hub, and then the seed corn of the next Silicon Valley can be established right there in the industrial Midwest. If you look at our nation's economic history, this is indeed how Silicon Valley was created initially, and it required some federal investment. And then later, it was the innovators and private investors and entrepreneurs who took over. Same thing applied in Route 128 and near Boston and the Research Triangle of North Carolina. So we know how to do this. We just need to go back and apply what we've learned over the years. And once again, harness the full potential of all Americans as we head more deeply into the 21st century.
Senator, one more question about the Hoosier state. You mentioned the kind of the integration of technology and national security. And we're starting to do some work with a new effort at Purdue, the Kroc Center on Technology and Foreign Policy, where Indiana is really trying to kind of drive this national conversation between kind of the heartland and what's happening overseas. Do you think that the Congress broadly appreciates that connection?
I don't. And I think it's important for Republicans and Democrats, of course, at the federal level, to make that argument so that our constituents understand. And I also think that increasingly, as we consider this U.S. Innovation and Competition Act through a regular order bipartisan process, my colleagues will have a heightened level of understanding about exactly how the domestic tech and competitiveness strengths of our economy complement our national security strengths, and vice versa. This has been the case over the years, but unless we're having that formalized conversation through committees of jurisdiction and by allowing our House and Senate to breathe through an amendment process, members aren't fully engaging. Our system does work. We did this over in the United States Senate when we passed our U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. I'll tell you, we didn't have roughly 70 votes when we began this process. We weren't even close to it. But as we allowed members to engage, to legislate, to dive into the process, to ask probing questions, and to receive solid answers, they became educated about the process, as did their constituents. And that's how we ended up with almost 70% of the United States Senate supporting this. The same thing did not happen in the House. And I think once we move to a conference committee, once again, we'll move back to a more bipartisan consultative process that serves a certain pedagogical function as well, right? It teaches my colleagues and the American people what this legislation is all about and why it's important.
So, Senator, look, I was going to dive into chips and energy innovation, but I can't pass up the opportunity to talk about regular order, this kind of mystical concept that used to underpin our democracy. You are someone who gets this. In fact, you're, I think, a recipient last year of Bipartisan Policy Center's Legislative Action Award. So roll with me here a little bit. We got two pretty big pieces of legislation, thematically going after the same problems, but different in their solutions. Where do you see kind of substantively the core of the engine of the bipartisan agreement that can move this actually to adoption?
Well, candidly, the conference report, when we sit down at that negotiation table, it's going to have to resemble the Senate work product in large measure if we're going to get this passed. I think there are really three important components to that work product, and I alluded to them earlier. One is semiconductor manufacturing. That's the CHIPS Act, which incentivizes businesses to do what some have already done, which is to locate their fabrication facilities in the United States. That, of course, is very important to our supply chain at a time when many auto assembly plants in the state of Indiana and other places don't have enough chips to produce all the automobiles that people are demanding. That's just one of many important examples. But it also, if we're making things here in the United States, in this case, computer chips, we're also, on the front lines of innovating as it relates to manufacturing processes. And that's a key point. So that's point number one. The second facet is the establishment of an applied research directorate. We'll call it the Tech Directorate at the National Science Foundation. Over the years, our federal government has done a good job in funding basic research. This is sort of curiosity-driven research at our nation's universities. But we have stopped funding some areas of applied research that aren't receiving much funding through regular market processes. And we really need to up our game in areas of applied research, especially those like artificial intelligence and quantum computing that have direct national security applications. And then the last pillar is, of course, the tech hub component of this, which arguably is the most important component of the overall legislation.
So, if we can go schoolhouse rock for a minute, a legislative conference is almost, it's a mythical being, white buffalo, Reagan Democrat. We have not seen these happen a lot in the last several years. Just take a few minutes and actually explain the premise of a conference and what some of the challenges are, just in terms of the timing of getting this done. Will we really have an official conference, or you think it's going to be the leadership kind of semi-conferencing across the aisle?
Well, of course, this statement will be met with skepticism, maybe a bit of excitement for those who follow these things closely. But I think we're poised to actually revisit Schoolhouse Rock and have a genuine sit-down conference, right? Where each side, at least in the case of a 50-50 Senate, has equal representation, where they sit down and respectfully negotiate and objectively negotiate the various issues. And then after doing that over a course of weeks or more likely months, we'll produce a conference report. And those conferees who have been appointed by their party leadership to sit as negotiators in that conference committee will either approve of that conference report by signing fixing their signature to it, and it will be voted by the House and the Senate, or they'll disapprove of it. And that is the most methodical, I think, responsible process. And it's a collaborative process that lends itself. If you can get this done, you get the muscle memory of negotiation and principled compromise going again, and the American people can be encouraged by this. They can be encouraged that their federal government can still tackle incredibly challenging issues. We can do important things, even during a time when our politics is tribalized and often falls short in terms of getting important legislation done.
Well, Senator, like Chris Matthews, I have a tingle. So we will be watching C-SPAN 8 religiously to track the process.
You and tens of other viewers.
Exactly. Look, one more question as we close this out, and I think it relates to the ability to get a true bipartisan package. We're spending a lot of time thinking about the role of innovation as we try to transition the economy to kind of a dynamic and low carbon future. A lot of interest in this kind of coming from the House. I don't frankly think there's been enough discussion of the potential importance of this legislation, like the infrastructure bill, to moving forward kind of the energy innovation industry. I just wonder if you had a thought or two about that before we let you go vote.
Sure. If you step back, big picture, again, this is about competitiveness and harnessing the talent of our researchers and our entrepreneurs and our financial markets to ensure that we win this century. As a subset of that, one area that we have designated as a key area of applied research over at the National Science Foundation will be advanced energy technologies. We already have the existing expertise in this area. Of course, the United States is a net exporter of oil and gas resources. That will continue to be the case over a number of years, I hope, because that's a real geopolitical and geostrategic advantage for our country. But increasingly, we all understand that these other technologies will become cost effective at the consumer level, and we want to lead the way in development of these technologies. So in addition to the Technology Directorate establishing this as a key area of research in our U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, we also ensure that we are countering the Chinese Communist Party, their Belt and Road Initiative, where they're investing fairly heavily in green energy technology development and distribution to other countries. We have a Strategic Competition Act component of our Senate bill that ensures we can compete as it relates to clean energy technologies as well. So it's just one of many subsets of our efforts to lead the world in developing next generation technologies, mostly national security technologies, as we head more deeply into the 21st century and compete against our leading strategic rival, which of course is Communist China.
Well, Senator, look, as we scan, as we do every day, the possibilities to move significant legislation, we keep coming back here in terms of its kind of substantive importance, but also the ability just to kind of resuscitate bipartisan, deliberate, principled discussion. And so really want to thank you for your leadership. I know there are many people who are watching who are eager to help get this done. And so really, thanks so much for what you're doing. And we look forward to watching the progress. I am now going to turn this over to Dane Stangler, who's BPC's Director of Strategic Initiatives, to lead the next panel.
Thanks, Jason. And thanks to Senator Young for an incredibly substantive conversation and for his leadership on this issue on Capitol Hill over the last 2 years. I now have the pleasure of moderating a really outstanding panel discussion of the issues that Senator Young talked about and this notion of competitiveness and the legislation that's making its way through Congress. I'm going to take a quick second to introduce our really illustrious panelists here. First, we have Marianne Feldman from UNC Chapel Hill. Marianne wears a variety of hats at the university. She's a distinguished professor of public policy, professor of finance at the Keenan Flagler Business School, and the research director of the Keenan Institute of Private Enterprise, which does outstanding work on innovation and entrepreneurship. Marianne, thanks for joining. We also have Chris Griswold, policy director from American Compass, which also does excellent work, including on the issues of competitiveness and innovation. Chris worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Marco Rubio and was really involved in some of the seminal thinking and texts that have laid the foundation for this bipartisan moment in Congress. So Chris, thanks for joining. And then lastly, we have John Newfer, CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association. John leads that organization, which has been really the leading advocate for strengthening and promoting the semiconductor industry that we heard Senator Young talk about in the US. And they've done some great work, especially the last couple of years, highlighting some of the challenges and opportunities. So John, thanks for joining. I want to start with a lightning round, a definitional lightning round for all of you. I want to go around briefly to each of you. We heard Senator Young talk about what competitiveness means to him and how he defines it, both nationally and internationally. So I want to go around to each of you, just a quick answer. What does this mean to you? How do you define competitiveness? And John, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Dane. Generally speaking, competitiveness means ensuring America is home to the high-level innovation, talent, and economic growth that will enable our country, our workers, to succeed and prosper well into the future. For us in the chip industry, that means industry and government working together to advance chip technology, improve our STEM education and high-skilled immigration systems, ensure free trade and open markets, very big deal for our industry, and level the global playing field when it comes to the cost of researching, manufacturing, and designing. Other countries are investing heavily to gain ground in chip technology. We should be doing the same thing here. And as Senator Young mentioned, the second American century won't happen by itself. It's going to take a lot of collaboration on the part of U.S. industry and government.
Thanks, John. I appreciate your mention in there too, especially about the talent, the worker and human capital component of this. Marianne, now to you. How do you see? What do you see what do you think of when you hear the word competitiveness?
Well, interestingly, competitiveness, when we think about it at a business school, we typically think about the competitiveness of individual firms. And so there is a long sort of intellectual history where we think about competitiveness and perfect competition, right? Large number of firms, easy entry. And so we have sort of moved away from that, where we have now a high degree of concentration in a lot of industries. I also want to mention that when we think about competitiveness, I mean, this again is the way that we grow the pie and we increase prosperity, but it's embedded in a system of business strategy. And so, over the long run, what we've seen is that how do firms secure a competitive advantage? It is either by being innovative and finding a niche that's profitable or by cutting costs. And unfortunately, in the US, I think since Milton Friedman said the duty of the corporation was to maximize shareholder value, we have seen a lot of leaning on cost cutting, which has really decreased our international competitiveness. And I think it's, sort of mentioned as the academic and the intellectual history, there are many trade economists who realized that they were wrong. The theories that they were proffering in the 80s and 90s have really not benefited the American economy, and specifically have not benefited American workers. So I think that we need to think about competitiveness a little bit differently to make sure that everyone is working in the same direction towards a goal of economic prosperity and renewal.
Well, thanks, Marianne. And just as John linked competitiveness to workers, to talent, to people, I appreciate you linking that to individual businesses, because when we talk about nations competing, as you point out, it's really the components of the country, especially our businesses, who compete with each other and internationally. Chris, turning to you, what does competitiveness mean to you?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really great question, and I really appreciate what Marianne just said. I think she nailed it by referencing our failed economic theories of the last few decades. For me, I think, competitiveness. I mean, we should step all the way back and ask what the dictionary definition of the word is, right? To be competitive means to be capable of winning a competition. And to be capable of winning a competition, you have to acknowledge that you're in one. And then you have to understand what the nature of that competition really is. And in the context of national economic policy, that means admitting that nations really do, in fact, economically compete. And that's really important, I think, to say at the outset, because that understanding, as Marianne referenced, is a significant departure from the economic orthodoxy that's reigned supreme for the last several decades. I saw an amazing quote from Paul Krugman the other day from the 90s, where he said, if we can teach our undergraduates to wince when they hear somebody talk about competitiveness, we'll have done our nation a great service. And that's been the prevailing opinion for a long time. So for me, the use of the term competitiveness should imply a kind of realistic admission about the way the world really works. And once we admit that, once we admit, as Senator Young mentioned, that we really are in an economic and geopolitical competition with China, for example, then that lets us ask all the other questions we need to ask, which is what this discussion is about. What industries matter and why? Why does it matter where production happens? How does innovation actually work? And all the other things we need to ask and answer to secure our national security and supply chains and economic resilience.
Thanks, Chris. Both you and Marianne have referred to this kind of the intellectual history here and what's changed and how we used to think about competitiveness in the 80s and 90s, and that something has changed and we're thinking about it differently, or we should be thinking about it differently today. Marianne, I wonder if you could take us through a little bit of that. How have economists, scholars of innovation, scholars of technology, how have you seen that evolution of thinking, and what is different today from 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Really, I think one of the most pressing problems right now is the rising income inequality, and also the fact that there are many places that have been left behind. And so really theories of international trade said that we would be better off if we had specialization in different countries, and then we should compensate the people who would be laid off, who would lose their jobs. But that never happened. And so what we are, I think, sort of now seeing is the emergence of, sort of new models, and they're not sort of lagging, I believe. We don't have a statement as powerful as Milton Friedman's statement that the purpose of the corporation is to maximize the shareholder value. And so, it's sort of people are now talking a lot about corporate responsibility and the way in which things are produced, sort of recognizing that we are in these sort of this complicated economy where things are interrelated. And so, there is, I think, a very nice sort of movement to look at redefining the role of corporations in society and really rethinking the, sort of workers, not as a cost, but as a productive input. And so, that change is sort of underfoot. I want to sort of also recognize that I think when we think about national competitiveness, one of the big surges has been the recognition that the locus of inventive and creative activity is at the regional level. And so this underlies the sort of technology hub proposal. And it really is then a matter of working with these local economies to sort of then create things that trickle up. Rather than trickle down, which had been such a dominant theme, it is a matter of creating this growth locally, creating synergies, and then allowing greater participation in the economy by a variety of different places and different actors.
I absolutely want us to get into a discussion about that regional component. It's a big part of the legislation in Capitol Hill, USICA and competes. We heard Senator Young talk about it. Absolutely, I want to make sure we get to that in this discussion. And Marianne, you also talk about kind of the corporate purpose or the nature of corporations. ESG, environmental social governance factors, it's something that has gained a lot of attention, a lot of financial investment in the last few years. It's something that BPC is working on, and at least in our conversations with Hill staff on both sides of the aisle, there's increasing recognition of as you point out, the close connection between ESG and competitiveness, and also the need for more movement here. And I think we have seen that growing recognition on Capitol Hill. Chris, the corollary to what Marianne has been talking about is kind of the political evolution here, and how views of competitiveness, of national policy, of industrial policy, which has been used with increasing frequency in the last few years, how has that changed? You worked on Capitol Hill, you worked for Senator Rubio. I think you were involved with a couple of the papers or reports that the senator produced on American investment and industrial policy. Take us through how you've seen the political context change over the last several years.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for reading. I'll let my former colleagues know they'll appreciate it. So just for reference, the texts that you're referring to are a few reports that Senator Rubio released back when he was chairman of the Small Business Committee. And just to summarize them very quickly, the first was on China's Made in China 2025 strategy, in which the Communist Party clearly outlined its very specific plans to dominate 10 critical industry areas in the 21st century. And what that report did was try to understand the implications of that fact, which, number one, were to again admit that the Chinese Communist Party clearly understood itself to be in fierce competition with us, and was organizing its economy accordingly. And the implications of that were really important. It meant that China was trying unilaterally, on the basis of its own economic strength, to set new terms for international economic competition in a way that merely appealing to kind of global trade rules and norms couldn't really do anything about. And if global trade norms weren't going to help us, then we better have a plan for our own industrial and innovative strength sufficient to answer the challenge. And the other thing that report concluded, which is something Marianne pointed out quite rightly, which is that the common defense of international trade, expanded trade with China in the 90s, including all of our offshoring, was wrong. The concept was totally flawed. The idea that we could design here and make there was just mistaken. The idea was that we could maintain our position at the high end of the value chain while China would handle the lower end. But what actually happened was that China started moving up the higher end of the value chain relative to us as well. We got how innovation works wrong. It does actually matter where things get produced. So that was the first report. And this very quickly, the second one simply pointed out that capital investment in America is declining, and is being, that decline is being driven largely by the fact that our economy has been financialized and is in the thrall of shareholder primacy theory. Marianne mentioned Milton Friedman. And one of the things that a quarterly returns obsessed financialized private sector does is underinvest in both productive industrial capacity and in science and research. Senator Young made this point about market forces on their own not now adequately investing in the kind of innovation and science that we need. Hence the need for public investment, number one, and for public policy to promote investment from the private sector. So those were the texts that you referenced. And to answer your question, at the time, those reports were sort of a voice crying in the wilderness. Industrial policy wasn't a phrase respectable economists were supposed to say. But as you mentioned, in the last few years, we've seen that change. And these concepts, what I just described, has become more widely accepted wisdom. Academics and think tanks across the political spectrum, including mine, have taken up the task. And there's also a new appreciation that industrial competitiveness has always been part of our history, all the way back to Alexander Hamilton. So there are still a lot of economists and libertarians who don't like it. And as Senator Young said, there's still a lot of work to do to help Congress connect the dots. But politicians in both parties are starting to understand that things haven't worked out the way we were told they would. And the only other point I would make there is I think part of the reason politicians get it now, increasingly get it anyway, is not just because they can see the problem for themselves, although leaders like Senator Young clearly can. It's also because politicians are responsive to the public, and the public absolutely gets it. A lot of working Americans have understood this problem for a long time. Offshoring our manufacturing cost millions of jobs, and a lot of those communities have never recovered. People have been angry for a while, and I think that anger has reached a political breaking point that politicians are starting to notice and respond to, and that's prompted leaders towards new approaches to trade and industrial policy and competitiveness.
Thanks, Chris. John, I want to take up a couple of these issues with you. First, I would be remiss if I didn't remind our audience to submit questions using the live chat function on YouTube or Facebook, and on Twitter using the hashtag BPC Live. John, we've heard Chris and Marianne talk about how the mindset and the thinking around competitiveness, around policy has changed. I want to ask you about some of the specific things that are in You Seek and Compete as regards semiconductors, but first, help us think about where the semiconductor industry fits into this kind of historical evolution. Where are we now? Where were we? And how are things changing?
Great questions, Dane. As you said, the global chip shortage has been a really very stark reminder of the ubiquity of semiconductors and their importance in virtually all areas of our society and economy as we just become amazingly digitalized. This industry has a proud history in America. Semiconductors were invented here more than 60 years ago, and US-based companies command the lion's share of the global market. We account for about half of the world's total chip sales. But we have lost ground in key areas, especially when it comes to where chips are made. In 1990, some of you may have heard these numbers before, 37% of the world's modern chip manufacturing capacity was located here in America. Today, it's only 12%, and it's continuing to fall. In addition, even as the cost of researching, designing, and manufacturing more and more advanced chips has increased, federal investments in chip research have been flat as a share of GDP for decades, while other countries have significantly ramped up research investments. Chris mentioned underinvestment in R&D by industry, but I'll say US chip companies plow about 1/5 of their revenues back into R&D, which is among the highest shares in any industry. But it's important for federal government to supplement those huge private investments with its own funding. Product development and product manufacturing work best in our industry when they happen in the same place. It's two sides of the same coin. When we produce more chips here, we do more of the research and development of those chips here. In addition, research funding and the activity it generates in the universities, centers of excellence, national labs, etc., is a major driver of talent and workforce development. It's a virtuous cycle we need to pump more oxygen into.
Thanks, John. We heard Senator Young mention a few times the CHIPS Act I think he highlighted this as one of the three key components that he sees, not just of USICA that he helped lead, but of what ultimately could be, the core of a bipartisan package. But tell our audience, what is the CHIPS Act? What does that do? And then what would the potential impact be?
Yeah, well, Senator Young and many of his colleagues in the Senate have been huge champions of the CHIPS Act and USICA, and the counterpart legislation in the House was just passed recently. All very helpful. I just want to offer my appreciation for the support of Senator Young for this historic legislation. Most relevant in both USICA and competes to the chip industry is the $52 billion to fund both critical semiconductor manufacturing incentives and research investments. This funding has the support of a broad bipartisan majority in both chambers. I know it's hard to believe we're actually there, but we are, and it's wonderful. Many of America's governors and mayors, a range of top national security experts, lots and lots of CEOs and business groups in many critical areas of our economy, and last but not least, the American public. As Chris said, in the end of the day, politicians are responsive to the public, and that's why we're seeing this legislation. The Senate passed USICA last June, and the House passed the America Competes a few weeks ago. Now leaders in both chambers must work together to work out differences in the bills and develop a compromise version that can be swiftly passed by both chambers and signed into law by the president. A $52 billion federal investment would spur hundreds of billions of dollars in company investments, create hundreds of thousands of US jobs, and usher in an historic resurgence of chip manufacturing in America. But the clock is ticking, and the time to act is now. Getting these investments across the finish line in short order would greatly strengthen America's economy, our national security, and make our supply chains more resilient. And our leadership position in a range of essential and emerging chip-enabled technologies would be much improved. Other countries are not waiting.
Thanks, John. For all the reasons that you have laid out, BPC, through our advocacy arm, BPC Action, endorsed what was Endless Frontier Act, what became USICA, for all the reasons you lay out for the strong bipartisan support. So thank you for that summary. John has gotten us into the discussion of the specific legislation that is making its way through Congress. I want to ask Chris and Mary Ann about some of those specific pieces, but first we have a couple of audience questions. One I'll save for a little bit later in the conversation, but one is on this question, this issue of industrial policy, Chris and Mary Ann, that you were talking about, and John, you alluded to in terms of semiconductor investment. So Rebecca Fenneman has asked, does industrial policy even still exist? Chris and Mary Ann, you talked about some of the intellectual evolution here, but I think there is this question of, what is it? I mean, we've talked about it, you're talking about it, it's popped up with increasing frequency, but does it in fact exist? Chris or Mary Ann, I'll let, or John, I'll let you, any of you jump in.
Let me say that we have a de facto industrial policy, which, as Chris mentioned, favors financialization. Mm-hmm. Right? And the growth of banking and venture capital, and the evolution of venture capital to look a lot more like banking. And so we have always had industrial policy. So Chris, I've never met you before, but we have a lot of similarities. And going back to Alexander Hamilton, right, and sort of thinking about what was the role of manufacturers in the economy, arguably, we've had industrial policy. We just don't want to acknowledge it. And I think that we need to think more strategically. I think that building back supply chains is very important, and that is a part of industrial policy. We focus a lot on science policy, and I think that we do need to be investing in science. But if we are investing in science without investing in industries and other downstream activities, we're simply pushing on a string.
No, I would agree entirely. And I mean, it's such a critical distinction that I think Marianne just made, which is it's about strategic decision making, which on the intellectual history side requires admitting that we're allowed to make strategic decisions, which a lot of economists would prefer that we not do. Um, but yeah, I mean, to be a supporter of industrial policy of any kind, I think you really just have to answer two questions. Do we care what industries the economy invests in? And if we do, is there anything we can do to try and promote that outcome? And I think the answer to both questions is yeah, we do care. We should anyway. And yeah, there are things we can do. So to give John and your industry some, some credit, and just kind of to echo what you said, you know, we did a little bit of research into the semiconductor industry, and found that there are significant. It costs us significantly more to do this here, anywhere from 30 to 60% more to manufacture chips here than elsewhere. And the primary explanation for that difference is the government support that other nations are pumping into the industry there. It's a very straightforward strategic question. Does the United States care about whether we can make chips? And if the answer is yeah, then we should do something about it.
So let me
I think it does. And as Marianne said, I think industrial policy does exist. The question is, not choosing is a choice. So let's be honest about the fact that we got to make a choice and do it right in the industries that matter.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The reality is the American economy does not function in a vacuum. We work in a global community that plays by different rules. Countries that have strong, focused, targeted industrial policies. And when it comes to chip manufacturing, it stands out starkly that strict adherence to market forces just simply doesn't work. Other countries have major incentives in place that make it much cheaper to build fabs, chip manufacturing facilities around the world, much more expensive to do it here. So we need the government to make this strategic choice of stepping in this case, and level the playing field. Because if we don't, the end game for us is virtually no chip manufacturing on U.S. shores, and that's probably not something that anyone really wants when you think it through.
Thank you. We've got a couple more audience questions. We'll again remind the audience that you can submit questions using the live chat feature on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. I want to get to a couple of those questions, but there's a couple more things I want to ask the panel as well. Marianne, you have just referenced a couple of pieces that are in the legislation, but also kind of relate more broadly to this competitiveness discussion. One thing, the legislation establishes a new technology directorate. It's called the Directorate at the National Science Foundation, where you've done, I think, a couple of tours there. There's also, you mentioned this complementarity between investments in research and supporting industries on the commercialization side. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about what you see as the need there on the industry, university, commercialization piece, and then how this technology directorate at NSF would work and promote those ends.
Great. So thank you, Dane. And so it's just absolutely true that I have been funded by the National Science Foundation. I worked at the National Science Foundation, and I've also studied the National Science Foundation, as an agency. And it is a really kind of remarkable place and a national sort of gem for us. And as they expand their mission, it really is creating a balance between NIH and NIH funding, which is just health, and health is important, but then also all of the rest of science. And so I think that, what we witness at NSF started the Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBIR program. And they've also been very creative in adapting it to the needs of small businesses and industry. But I want to mention sort of three things I think that will be critical. We're going to be funding more research, and the Bayh-Dole Act gave universities ownership of the intellectual property that results from federally funded research. This passed in 1980. And universities have responded by creating tech transfer offices that manage this commercialization process. But in many ways, this is an unfunded mandate. You can own the intellectual property, but there is no funding to secure that it is going to be commercialized. It's going to end up in the hands of firms. And so this is, sort of something, if there was a set aside to better fund the translation and tech transfer activities, I think that that would enable the legislation to have its impact. And so really, this is like so beautiful to see this coming together, but the devil is in the details of the implementation. I also want to say, as we think about these hubs, it's important. What we're doing is building ecosystems. And the idea of ecosystems has replaced the older concept of clusters. And really, ecosystems are more organic in their formulation, and they require a lot of local involvement. And here, the Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration has been funding many projects that are sort of furthering this end. So there is a need to sort of look at the synergies between science funding and other activities, and specifically to let local areas sort of define where they're going. But I think also, we tend to focus on VC funding, and what we see is that really VC funding will fund small firms, but then will tend to pull them to Silicon Valley, pull them to the locations where they're located, with the idea that the firm will be sold or acquired in a finite period of time. So this does not allow the local areas that are incubating these firms and sort of creating them to realize the value and the employment potential of new firms that are really, sort of the innovative engine of the US economy. And I think also we have to be concerned about monopoly power in the US. And so that what we have is a lot of small firms who are starting to sort of scale. They're going to be acquired by these monopolists, and they're not able to compete against them. And so it really requires sort of some fine tuning to different components if we want to realize the potential of this act.
Thanks, Marianne. You have made a number of excellent points in there, and all issues that I wish we had time to get into. We've got maybe 8 or 9 minutes left. I have a couple of wrap-up questions for all of you, kind of some looking forward questions, but I want to make sure we get in a couple of audience questions. We have multiple questions from the audience regarding something we heard Senator Young talk about, which is the relation between energy innovation and our energy challenges and competitiveness. A subset of that question, as Senator Young described it too, a subset of that question, John, I think directed for you, is the relation between rare earth elements and critical minerals in semiconductor manufacturing. So John and Chris and Marianne, I think you may have done some work on energy innovation. I want to just open that up to any of you to talk about this relation between energy innovation, climate change and economic competitiveness. But John, I'll throw it to you first to see if you have a comment on this rare earth elements, critical minerals question.
Yeah, the reality is for our industry, we are not wildly exposed in that regard. Most of the raw materials, the key raw material is silica, which silicon sand, which comes from quartz sand. We get from strategic allies, and so we're really not heavily exposed. On the climate change issue, I just want to say that chips are absolutely critical for helping us sort through better solutions to climate change, and they really are a kind of a big component to that, AI chips and others, and that's just another reason that we need to get this USICA and COMPETES legislation through Congress.
Thanks, John. Chris, any thoughts on this link between energy innovation, the energy challenges we face, and national competitiveness policy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just as a general matter, I think you see a really good example of how energy dependence has geopolitical implications right now in Europe with the crisis we're facing in Ukraine, right? Europe, Germany especially, is incredibly dependent on Russian energy sources, and that creates geopolitical problems. So sure, just as a general matter, yeah, the better a job we do at investing in our own energy innovation and independence across the board, yeah, of course it's essential.
Thanks, Chris. We got just a few minutes left. I want to end on an optimistic note. Let's assume that Congress, we get through the formal conference process, this mythical creature that Jason described with Senator Young, and Congress passes something, a bipartisan competitiveness bill. Do we declare mission accomplished? Is the job done? Like, what do each of you think? Okay, the bill passes, but what else needs to be done? Is this the end of the beginning? Is this kind of the end? Is this simply a first step? Marianne, I'll turn to you first, then John, and then Chris to take us home. So Marianne, what needs to happen after legislation passes?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I think that, simply getting this across the finish line is a big victory. What we are seeing is a once in a generation investment in science and innovation that's unprecedented in my lifetime. And so I think that there is just great potential. But again, this, sort of many times the, sort of dreams in Washington are dashed in the heartland through bad implementation. And so I think that a lot of attention needs to be paid to the details to make sure that we're talking about competitiveness and innovation, but really the objective is to increase American prosperity. And I think that that's got to be kept in mind. And I think also that, again, the best plans in Washington will not be realized unless we can get firms on board and can get, firms to adjust their thinking.
Thanks, Marianne. And taking a cue from some of your earlier comments, I think that regional piece, the innovation ecosystem piece, clearly an implementation priority, no matter what gets done in Washington. John, you represent a number of those firms that Marianne is talking about and has referred to. What do you think is going to still need to be done? CHIPS Act passes as part of this. What else needs to happen in terms of semiconductor?
Well, in terms of CHIPS Act, $52 billion is certainly not chopped liver, but once we get this passed, we will not be able to declare mission accomplished. But I will say it's a great start. As I mentioned before, enactment of competitiveness legislation would provide a huge return on investment. I expect government leaders will see this and be eager to enact similar measures in the future to reap the benefits for the American economy, job creation, national security, and supply chain resilience. In terms of priorities that can be advanced soon after the competitiveness legislation is enacted, we believe an investment tax credit for semiconductor manufacturing and design expenses would be a very helpful complement to the grants and research investments included in USICA and COMPETES. We also support continuing efforts to strengthen America's STEM education system, reform high-skilled immigration laws, promote free trade and open markets, and protect the industry's valuable intellectual property, among a number of other priorities.
Thanks, John. Chris, I'm going to turn to you to take us home. Marianne highlighted implementation. John has highlighted many other pieces that need to get done, and also painted this as a kind of, passing this legislation will help policymakers kind of see the light for further action. But what else do you see is going to need to get done?
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I think it would be a mistake to see the passage of a single bill as kind of the end point. I think what we need is a shift in mindset about economic policy. Sometimes I think we should stop calling ourselves a developed nation. It kind of implies that we can be complacent. I think what we need is a mindset of, to steal a phrase from Michael Lind and Rob Atkinson, a mindset of developmentalism, in which we are continually investing in our own capacity, our innovation, as just a way of doing economics for the long haul. So to the extent that the passage of this bill helps put us on that path of a shift in strategy and approach to our economics, then I think it's great, but it's certainly not the end point. And I also think on the specific question, it really depends on what the negotiators end up with. There are a couple ideas in one version or the other of these bills that are really ambitious that I hope make it into the final product. And if they don't, we're going to have to circle back to them. One that I'm particularly hot on is the Competes Act provision for an outbound investment review authority, where if a U.S. firm wants to offshore a critical capacity, the president can just say no. I think that's awesome. I really hope that makes it into the final package. And if it doesn't, we'll need to come back and try again. Similarly, one of the things we haven't talked about, I think, enough is how innovation gets financed. We need a national development bank or some way to invest on the financing side, whether that's coordinating the existing financing authorities that federal agencies already have, whether that's a new facility like a development bank, whether that's the Compete Act's Office of Supply Chain Resiliency idea, which has $45 billion to invest directly in critical manufacturing capabilities. Whatever it looks like, we've got to get that right. So there are a number, I think, of the more ambitious ideas that are on the table that I really hope make it across the finish line. And if they don't, we'll have to keep at it.
Thanks, Chris. Well, sadly, we are out of time. We could clearly go all day on these topics. There were too many audience questions to get to. Thank you to our audience for submitting them. I apologize we didn't get to them, but as our panelists have highlighted, they are all questions that are important and that BPC and our partners will continue to pursue. So I want to thank Marianne, John, and Chris for participating. Thank you, Senator Young, for participation in his remarks, and thank our audience. And we'll see